The sun had barely risen over the flat, cracked earth of the Oklahoma Territory when the stagecoach rattled through the narrow canyon pass, its wheels kicking up a fine orange dust that hung in still morning air like smoke from a dying fire. The driver, a weathered old man named Coop, kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his jaw working slowly on a piece of dried tobacco, his knuckles white against the leather reins. He had made this run 100 times before, and each time he told himself it would be the last. But here he was again, hauling gold and passengers through the most dangerous stretch of land between Fort Reno and the settlement of Clearwater. Inside the coach, a young woman named Elena sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes drifting between the dusty window and the man seated across from her. He was lean and long-limbed, dressed in a trail, worn duster the color of pale sand, with a wide, brimmed hat pulled low enough to shadow the upper half of his face. His boots were scuffed and worn, and at his hip rode a single Colt revolver, its grip worn smooth from years of use. He had not spoken a word since boarding the stage 2 stops back, at the small depot town of Red Rock, and something about his silence was more unsettling than any amount of talk could have been. Elena studied him carefully, the way she had been taught to study things at the school back east, where she had spent the better part of 5 years. She noticed the way his hands rested with a casual readiness in his lap, the way his breathing remained slow and even, and the way his eyes, even from beneath the brim of that hat, seemed to track every movement outside the coach window without appearing to move at all. She had seen men like him before, or rather, she had heard about them. Men who lived by some private code that was older and harder than the law, who carried the weight of something unspoken across their shoulders the way other men carried saddle bags. The other passengers were a banker from Tulsa named Greer, soft and pink. Faced with a briefcase he clutched to his chest as though it contained his soul, and a traveling medicine salesman named Perkins, who had fallen asleep somewhere around the 2nd mile and had been snoring steadily ever since. Neither of them paid the quiet stranger much attention, which told Elena something about the nature of men who lived too comfortably within the walls of their own world. The stranger's name, though Elena did not yet know it, was John. Not Oklahoma John in the way he thought of himself, but that was what people called him in the territories, in the saloons and the sheriff's offices and the campfire circles of men who traded stories the way merchants traded goods. Oklahoma John. It was a name that carried weight, the kind of weight that sometimes preceded a man into a room before he had even opened the door. John had not chosen this particular stagecoach by accident. He had ridden hard for 2 days from the Arizona border, following a cold trail that had been left 4 months ago by a man named Decker, a former Confederate raider turned outlaw who had gathered around him a pack of like-minded men and who had been bleeding the territory dry through a series of robberies and killings that had left 3 settlements without their savings and 2 good marshals without their lives. John had a personal reason for finding Decker, one that went back further than the law's interest in the man, back to a burned farmhouse on a quiet stretch of land near the Canadian River, back to a family that no longer existed. He had learned through a contact in Red Rock that Decker planned to hit the Clearwater stage. The gold in the strongbox beneath Coop's seat was enough to make any outlaw's mouth water, and Decker was nothing if not predictable when money was involved. So John had bought himself a ticket and settled in, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that most things in life, good or bad, came to you eventually if you simply stayed still long enough. Elena, for her part, had not planned to notice the stranger at all. She was on her way to Clearwater to join her father, a doctor who had established a small practice there after her mother's death 2 years ago. She was tired from the journey and anxious about what she would find when she arrived. She had not seen her father in 18 months, and people changed in 18 months, especially in places as hard and unforgiving as the Oklahoma Territory. But something about the quiet man across from her kept pulling at her attention the way a loose thread pulls at a careful mind. It was, she would later realize, the stillness in him. Not a dead stillness, not the stillness of someone who had given up on the world, but a living stillness, the kind that exists at the center of something that is coiled and ready. She had seen it once in a hawk perched on a fence post outside her school, watching the field below with that same terrible patience, and she had understood even then that what she was seeing was not peace but readiness. The attack, when it came exactly the way John had expected it to. The canyon narrowed at a certain point about 12 miles east of Clearwater, where the walls rose high enough on either side to block most of the morning light, and the trail dipped down through a shallow creek crossing. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Decker had never been a man who resisted the obvious. John heard the first shot before anyone else in the coach had registered the change in the horse's rhythm, and he was already moving before the second shot hit the coach door with a sound like a fist punching through wet wood. He threw himself across the interior of the coach, pulling Alina down and flat across the seat in a single motion, his body covering hers as the coach lurched and swayed. Greer made a sound like a man who had just swallowed something wrong, and Perkins woke up from his sleep with such violence that he struck his head against the overhead luggage rack and sat blinking in confused pain. Outside, Coop was shouting something that was lost in the thunder of the horses and the steady crack of rifle fire from the canyon walls. John had his Colt out by the time he lifted himself from Alina, crouching low at the window and taking a quick raid of the situation. He counted at least 5 riders dropping down from the canyon rim, moving fast and spreading out to box the coach in. They wore bandanas pulled up over their faces, but the lead rider's horse, a big gray with a distinctive blaze marking on its forehead, told John everything he needed to know. He had heard about that gray horse from a man in Reed Rock, who had survived one of Decker's earlier raids. Decker was here, riding point on his own job the way he always did, which meant the man was either arrogant or had some deeper reason for wanting to be present for this particular score. The coach ground to a halt as Coop's horses were cut off, and John opened the door on the sheltered side and dropped to the ground, staying low, using the body of the coach for cover. He fired twice in quick succession, and one of the flanking riders went down from his saddle with a cry that echoed sharply off the canyon walls. The others pulled back a few yards, and for a moment there was an odd pocket of silence in the middle of all the noise and dust and violence, the kind of silence that sometimes appears in the eye of a thing when both sides are taking stock. Then Decker's voice came down from the trail, smooth and unhurried in the way that dangerous men's voices often are when they hold the advantage, or believe they do. He called out that there was no reason for anyone else to get hurt, that all he wanted was the strongbox, and they could all be on their way. It was the kind of speech that sounded reasonable from a distance and meant nothing at all when you knew the man saying it, when you knew what he had done to people who had taken him at his word before. John did not answer. He moved instead, low and quick along the side of the coach, putting himself in a position that changed the geometry of the standoff. 2 of Decker's men had dismounted and were moving on foot toward the rear of the coach, thinking to come at it from both ends at once. John took the closer one out of the equation with a single shot, and drove the second back behind a boulder with 2 more. He was already repositioning before the echoes died. Inside the coach, Alina had not stayed flat the way John had positioned her. She had, after a moment of genuine fear that surprised her with its intensity, found something steadier underneath it. She was a doctor's daughter, which meant she had grown up around the management of crisis, around the idea that panic was a luxury that cost other people more than it was worth. She found Perkins's coat, which he had folded and placed on the overhead shelf, and used it to pack against the wound in Coop's arm where a bullet had grazed him when he fell from the box. Coop protested that he was fine in the particular way that men protest when they are not fine at all, but he let her work, and the bleeding slowed. Greer, the banker, had pressed himself into the far corner of the coach with his briefcase across his face like a shield, which Elena privately thought said everything there was to say about the man. The fight in the canyon went on for something that felt like a long time, but was probably closer to 8 or 10 minutes, the compressed and brutal kind of time that moves differently when men are shooting at each other in an enclosed space. John worked his way around the ambush with the methodical efficiency of someone who had survived enough of these situations to have moved past fear into something more functional, a kind of cold clarity that was not quite calm, but served the same purpose. He was not unscathed. A bullet had cut across his left forearm somewhere in the second exchange, leaving a burning crease that would need attention later, and his coat had taken another round through the shoulder that had missed flesh, but had him moving carefully to check that it had. By the time the last of Decker's riders had broken and fled back up the canyon wall, John was standing in the middle of the trail with 3 men down and the gray horse standing riderless near the creek crossing. Decker himself had not fled. He was on the ground, disarmed, sitting with his back against a boulder and holding his right hand against his chest where a bullet had gone through the palm, which was the kind of injury that ends a man's shooting days permanently and tends to change his perspective on a variety of things. John walked over to him without hurrying. He stood looking down at the man who had been at the center of his thoughts for the better part of 4 months, and he felt something he had not entirely expected to feel, which was a kind of exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, though that was there too, but something deeper, a weariness with the whole long chain of cause and effect that had brought him to this particular spot in this particular canyon on this particular morning. Decker looked up at him with the eyes of a man who has run out of options and knows it. He was not what he looked like in John's imagination, which was to say, he was not a monster in any obvious way. He was middle-aged and lean, with a face that had been hardened by years of weather and bad choices, and he looked at John with something that might have been recognition. He said he knew who John was, said it had only been a matter of time. John said nothing to that. He reached down and took Decker's remaining weapon, a small derringer that the man had been moving his good hand toward with the slow hopefulness of someone who believes in small miracles, and he pocketed it. Then he straightened and turned and walked back toward the coach, because Decker was going to be handed to the territorial marshal at Clearwater, and the territorial marshal was going to have to figure out what came next, and that was the arrangement that John had made with himself when he had decided to do this the right way rather than the other way, which had been the easier way and one that had tempted him more than he liked to admit. Elena was standing beside the coach when he came back. She had helped Coop down from where he had dragged himself back up onto the box, and she had done what she could for his arm with the limited materials available, and she was watching John approach with an expression that was direct and unfrightened, which he noticed because it was not the expression he usually received when he came walking back from something like this. She asked him if he was hurt, nodding at his left arm where the blood had soaked through his sleeve and dried to a dark stain. He said it was nothing serious. She said it would need to be cleaned and wrapped properly, or it would be serious, and the matter of fact way she said it made him pause. He was not accustomed to being looked at with concern that had no performance in it. They got the coach moving again with Coop on the box and Decker trussed up and riding in the boot with his hand wrapped in a strip of cloth from Perkins's shirt, which Perkins donated with Specific generosity of a man who is grateful to still be alive. Greer had emerged from his corner and was trying to re-establish some dignity by straightening his jacket and remarking that he had always known something like this would happen